The engine cut out at 2,000 feet, and for 3 full seconds, neither of us breathed. The small Cessna dropped like a stone released from a fist, the altimeter needle spinning backward, and in that silence, that terrifying, weightless silence, I heard her voice for the first time, not as a student, but as a woman who thought she was about to die. "Talk to me," she whispered, hands frozen on the yoke. "Please, just talk to me." That single moment, 30,000 feet above the ordinary world, would change everything I thought I understood about fear, about control, and about the walls I had spent years building around my own heart. If you believe people deserve second chances, if you believe two broken souls can somehow save each other, then before you go any further, hit that like button, drop a comment below, share this with someone who needs a little hope today, and subscribe to the channel, because stories like this one deserve to be heard, and remembered. My name is Daniel Reyes, and for 11 years I had been a flight instructor at a small regional airfield in Colorado, the kind of place where the wind never really stopped and the runway lights flickered against the mountains like tired stars. I had trained hundreds of students, engineers chasing a childhood dream, retirees finally checking a box on their bucket list, nervous teenagers whose parents had more money than patience. I was good at my job because I had learned, a long time ago, to keep my distance. Flying was mathematics and muscle memory. It was throttle and pitch and yaw. It was not supposed to be personal. Then Elena Marsh walked into my life on a gray Tuesday morning in March, 11 months after I had buried my wife. I remember the paperwork more than I remember her face, that first day. 34 years old. No prior flight experience. Reason for enrollment: I need to prove to myself I can still be brave. I almost laughed at that line, scrawled in blue ink on the intake form, because I had stopped believing in bravery as anything other than a word people used before they quit. Grief does that to you. It hollows out the parts of you that used to hope, and it dares you to call the empty space acceptance. Elena was quiet in a way that felt deliberate, like silence was something she had built for herself out of necessity. She had lost her husband 2 years earlier, a helicopter crash, ironically, doing the very thing she now wanted to learn, and she carried that loss the way some people carry a stone in their shoe, limping through life pretending it didn't hurt with every step. We didn't talk about any of that in the beginning. We talked about airspeed indicators and pre-flight checklists and the correct way to trim an aircraft for level flight. I kept things professional, distant, safe. She kept things guarded, careful, safe. Two people orbiting each other's pain without ever touching it. The first few lessons were unremarkable, at least on the surface. She was a nervous flyer, understandably so, and her hands would tremble slightly on the controls every time we hit turbulence, every time the plane dipped even a few feet without warning. I would talk her through it in the calm, practiced monotone I used with every anxious student: eyes on the horizon, trust the instruments, trust yourself. It was a script I had recited so many times it had stopped meaning anything to me. But something about the way she listened, really listened, like my words were a rope she was gripping over a canyon, made me start to actually hear myself again. It was during our 6th lesson that she asked me the question that would echo through every quiet moment of my life afterward. We had just leveled off after a rough patch of wind, and I could see her knuckles white against the yoke, her breathing shallow and fast. I reached over, the way I always did with nervous students, and adjusted her grip, told her to loosen her fingers, to breathe with the plane instead of against it. She turned her head toward me then, her eyes still wide with adrenaline, and asked, almost teasingly, almost desperately, "Do I make you nervous, instructor?" I never answered. I told myself it was because the radio crackled at that exact moment, air traffic control requesting our position, and by the time I responded to them, the moment had passed, swallowed by procedure and static. But that was a lie I told myself for a long time. The truth was simpler and far more terrifying. I didn't answer because I didn't trust what I would say if I opened my mouth. Because somewhere in the 11 weeks since she'd started lessons, this woman with sad eyes and trembling hands had cracked something open in me that I had sealed shut the day I signed my wife's death certificate. And I was not ready, not even a little, to let anyone see that crack. We continued like that for months. Lessons on Tuesdays and Thursdays, sometimes Saturdays when the weather cooperated. She improved steadily, the way people do when they're running from grief instead of walking through it, fast, determined, almost angry in her progress, as if mastering the aircraft might somehow master the loss underneath it. I watched her land smoother, react quicker, breathe easier at altitude. I told myself I was simply doing my job well. I told myself the warmth I felt watching her confidence grow was professional pride and nothing more. I was, by then, an expert at lying to myself. Grief teaches you that skill too, whether you want it or not. There were moments, though, that punctured the careful distance we maintained. Once, after a hard lesson where she'd nearly lost control during a simulated engine failure, we sat on the tarmac afterward in silence, the sun setting orange and merciless behind the mountains, and she told me about her husband. About how he had kissed her goodbye that morning like it was any other morning, how the helicopter company had called her at 2:47 in the afternoon, how she had been standing in a grocery store aisle holding a box of pasta when her entire life ended. She told me she took flying lessons not despite the fear, but because of it, because somewhere in her broken heart she believed that if she could learn to control an aircraft, she could learn to control the terror that lived in her chest every single day since his death. I didn't tell her about my wife that day. I wasn't ready. But I sat beside her in that silence, and for the first time in almost a year, I didn't feel entirely alone. The near crash happened on a Thursday in late September, 7 months into her training, during what should have been a routine solo-supervised flight, her first time at the controls with minimal intervention from me, a milestone we had both been building toward. We were at 2,000 feet when the engine sputtered, coughed, and died, the propeller windmilling uselessly against the thin mountain air. I remember the instant clarity that comes with true danger, how every unnecessary thought evaporates and only the essential remains. Elena's hands locked on the yoke, her face drained of color, and she turned to me with something between panic and pleading and asked me to talk to her, to just talk to her, please. And so I did. I talked her through the emergency procedures step by step, fuel selector, mixture, carb heat, best glide speed, my voice steadier than I felt, because somewhere underneath the checklist recitation, I was terrified too, terrified of losing her the way I had lost my wife, terrified that fate might be cruel enough to take 2 people from me in the exact same year. We found a flat stretch of ranch land 4 miles from the nearest road, and Elena, shaking, sweating, more alive than I had ever seen another human being, landed that dead-stick Cessna in a field of dry grass with a precision that stunned every instructor at our airfield when they heard the story afterward. We climbed out of that aircraft together, legs unsteady, adrenaline still roaring through our veins, and without either of us deciding to do it, we held each other in that empty field beneath a darkening October sky, 2 survivors clinging to proof that they were still, against all odds, breathing. That was the moment the silence between us finally broke. Not with grand declarations, but with something quieter and more honest, with her finally saying, voice muffled against my shoulder, "You still haven't answered my question," and me finally, after 7 months of careful evasion, admitting the truth. Yes. She made me nervous. Not because I doubted her skill in a cockpit, but because somewhere in the wreckage of my grief, she had become the first thing that made me want to keep living instead of merely surviving. I told her about my wife, about the cancer that had taken 18 months to steal her from me, about the year of silence and numbness that followed, about how I had thrown myself into teaching strangers to fly because it was easier than learning to feel anything at all. I told her that her question, asked so simply months before, had haunted every quiet hour since, because answering it honestly meant admitting I was capable of feeling something again, and I hadn't been ready to face that truth. If this story is touching your heart right now, if you've ever loved someone through grief, or found unexpected hope in the middle of your pain, please take a moment to like this video and leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. It means more than you know, and it helps this story reach the people who need it most. What followed wasn't a fairy tale, because real healing rarely looks like one. There were setbacks. Nights when Elena would disappear into herself, overwhelmed by guilt for feeling joy again, convinced she was betraying her late husband simply by allowing herself to fall in love a second time. There were nights when I retreated into old habits of isolation, frightened by how much I had come to need her presence, terrified that opening my heart again meant opening it to being broken all over again. Grief, we learned together, doesn't disappear just because happiness arrives. It sits beside joy, uninvited but permanent, and the real work isn't erasing the pain but learning to carry both at once. We took it slow, deliberately, respectfully, mindful of what we had both lost, mindful of the ghosts that still lived quietly in both our homes. Elena completed her pilot's license in the spring, nearly a year after that first form landed on my desk with its trembling handwriting about proving her own bravery. I was there on the tarmac the day she took her final check ride, standing where family and instructors gather to watch, and when she taxied back after passing, when she climbed out of that cockpit with tears streaming and a smile I will remember until the day I die, I understood finally and completely what her question had really meant, all those months before, in that shaking little airplane. She hadn't only been asking if she made me nervous as her instructor. She had been asking, in the only language she could find the courage for, whether it was possible for two shattered people to build something whole together. Whether love after loss was a betrayal or a continuation. Whether the human heart, however broken, still had room to grow toward someone new without abandoning who came before. We married 18 months after that engine failure over the mountains, in a small ceremony at the very airfield where we'd met, surrounded by fellow pilots and instructors who had watched our slow, careful transformation from student and teacher into something neither of us had dared hope for again. Elena flies recreationally now, taking her own students up on clear afternoons, always telling them the same thing I once told her: trust the instruments, trust the horizon, and above all, trust that you are stronger than the fear trying to convince you otherwise. I still teach, though these days I find myself paying closer attention to the quiet ones, the ones who ask unexpected questions mid-flight, the ones who might be trying, in their own frightened way, to ask if it's safe to hope again. Before I close this story, I want to ask something small but meaningful from you. If any part of this touched you, please leave just one word in the comments below: hope. It costs nothing, but it lets me know this story reached someone, and it lets other viewers scrolling through know that this story is worth their time too. Grief will always be part of my story, and part of Elena's, the way turbulence is simply part of flying, unavoidable, sometimes terrifying, but never permanent, never the whole journey. What I learned in that shuddering, silent airplane, and in the trembling months before and after it, is that the bravest thing any of us can do is answer honestly when someone asks if they matter to us, not with silence, not with deflection, but with the truth, however frightening that truth might be. I waited 7 months to answer Elena's question. I have spent every day since making sure she never has to wonder again. If this story moved you even a little, please like this video, share it with someone who needs a reminder that second chances are real, and subscribe to the channel for more stories about love, loss, and the unexpected courage it takes to keep flying anyway. Thank you for staying with us until the very end.